Good morning and welcome to this Georgetown on the Hill event. My name is John Mayo. I am the Elsa Carlson McDonough Chair of Business Administration at the McDonough School of Business here at Georgetown. I'm also a professor of economics, business, and public policy here in the McDonough School. And I think most importantly for today, I am the executive director for our host institution, which is the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. We appreciate you all attending. For those of you who do not know and are not really familiar with the center, the mission of the center is to foster and amplify discussion, debate, dialogue on issues that lie at the nexus of business and public policy. So today, what we're going to do is discuss the Infrastructure Investment for Jobs Act, also known as the IIJA. You'll hear that term a lot. So IIJA, short for the Infrastructure Investment for Jobs Act, which was signed into law just almost exactly a year ago today. As all of you know, the legislation was notable for a number of reasons. Let me highlight two. One is just simply in a political domain. It was notable because it was bipartisan. It's a substantive piece of legislation that enjoyed support from both Republicans and Democrats. And in an economic front, on the economic front, it was notable for the magnitude of the spending that was involved under the umbrella of the IIJA. $1 trillion or so is going to be spent on infrastructure projects in the United States. Of that total, fully $550 billion of the IIJA funding is newly allocated dollars. And to state the obvious, that's a lot of money. So while the total amount of spending and the promise that it holds for improving the nation's infrastructure is really high, I think it also compels just a raft of additional questions that center not on the euphoria of passing the law or the total amount of spending, but on the implementation process itself. What are the policies, the allocation mechanisms, the processes that can be implemented to allocate these funds in a way that they will be spent in the most efficient manner possible. Economists routinely worry about how institutional mechanisms can either accelerate or impede the efficient allocation of resources. In this case, the IIJA can suggest this is really important because of the magnitude of the spending. If you think about just let's call it a 5% slip between cup and lip of spending on the new funds, you're looking at $25 billion that is foregone as an opportunity to actually improve the nation's infrastructure. And conversely, if the monies are 5% are spent well, that's another $25 billion that goes in the ground to improve the nation's infrastructure. So today, what we have done is to decide to focus on three of the really important areas in the IIJA. Number one, highways, roads, and bridges. Number two, railroads. And number three, broadband. And for this discussion, I am just delighted to say that we have three of the nation's foremost experts in these sectors to share their insights on the implementation challenges and opportunities that are going to be involved with the IIJA. So let me introduce them momentarily, but first, let me, in the spirit of being an educator, let me lay out what I think we might reasonably expect for our goals today. Three goals. Number one, we are early in the implementation stage. At this point, seemingly small course corrections can make a huge difference down the road of the ultimate efficacy of this legislation, of this act. This forum, I hope, will put into public view some of the opportunities for those corrections and to allow policymakers and those that are implementing the IIJA to move on that. Second goal is that this forum should, I hope, accelerate a discussion of best practices and the implementation advice we have from our experts in their respective areas, and also to promote, let's call it, cross-sector lessons and takeaways. Third, as I looked at the list of attendees for this particular event, I was particularly impressed by the number of experts that we have in the audience. We would really like to hear your questions. Obviously, we're in a Zoom format and a webinar format, and that makes the process of Q&A a little bit more formal. But we certainly do want to encourage your questions. Please, just as questions dawn on you, please type them into the chat thread. Those questions will be curated as we go forward, and time permitting, we're going to address those questions during the Q&A session. Now, let me turn to a brief introduction of the panelists. They are all notable, and we could go on for a long time about them, but in the interest of time, let me just briefly introduce our distinguished panel. First, Matt Turner is a professor of economics at Brown University. He's also a research associate at NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's the co-editor of the Journal of Urban Economics. He's written widely on the subject of roads, urban economics, infrastructure. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in economics from Brown University. We're thrilled to have Matt here with us today. Secondly, Fred Miller. Fred is an associate general counsel and government affairs liaison for the Association of American Railroads. He previously served as general counsel at the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure at the U.S. House of Representatives. And he's also been a lecturer at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law, where he received his law degree. Third, let me introduce Scott Walston. Scott is the president of the Technology Policy Institute and is also a senior fellow at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. He is an economist with expertise in industrial organization and public policy. His research focuses on, among other things, competition, regulation, telecommunications. He was the economic director of the Federal Communications Commission's National Broadband Plan, a lot of expertise in broadband, and has been a lecturer at Stanford University's public policy program. He previously was a staff economist at the U.S. President's Council of Economic Advisors, and he holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University. Finally, let me introduce my colleague, Jeff Macker, who will help me with the moderation and hosting activities today. Jeff is a professor of strategy, economics, and policy here at Georgetown in the McDonough School. He's also the academic director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Jeff's research spans a number of areas that touch on infrastructure, including electricity, telecommunications, and railroads. Jeff has an undergraduate degree from a pretty good football school, the University of Michigan. We'll find out how good a little later this year, and a master's degree in business from Dartmouth and a PhD from UC Berkeley. So I hope you'll agree with me that we have a great panel. So let me turn to some questions just to kick this off. And let me set the stage here by asking each of the panelists if you could offer a few thoughts on why additional investment in each of your particular sectors is important. What's the upside? What's the upside potential? And what I've asked folks to do is take a lead on a particular area. Matt is going to lead us on roads, bridges, and highways. Scott will lead us on broadband, Fred on rail. Let me begin with Matt. Matt, let me pitch that to you and let you take it away.
Thank you, John, and for the opportunity to be on the panel and for the generous introduction. So the IIJA has about $550 billion in new money, which is above and beyond sort of regular appropriations. Of that, it's about $50 billion a year for the federal aid highway system over 5 years. So $250 billion of new money for the federal aid highway system. The baseline funding level for that program is about $200 million a year. So that's about a 25% fall over 5 years. Right, so that's a lot. It's a tremendous amount of money, absolutely, and it's a pretty big chunk of regular funding. So the question that we should be asking ourselves is why do we want to spend another $50 billion a year on the federal aid highway system? And I think there's sort of two classes of answers to that. One is we want to spend money on things that people use, right? And so I think that that's the economist stock answer is giving people things that they want in a cost-effective way is generally a good idea. Okay. The second reason we might want to do it is because there are these sort of knock-on effects, right? Which is things that are sort of hard to see. It promotes economic efficiency. It increases economic opportunity, those kinds of things. I think that those things are hard to measure and hard to document. And so I think we want to be really careful spending money to accomplish these sort of intangibles, right? Because they're hard to measure and hard to document. Those effects are uncertain. So I think that the first order should be, let's try to build things that people want to use. So focusing money on that. The second argument, sort of in line with that, building things people want to use is some of the stuff is worn out, or the argument is widely made that the roads are worn out. That seems to be false for the interstate system, right? So the Federal Highway Administration does a fabulous job of keeping track of the interstate, and every year they require state DOTs to run an instrument down the rightmost lane of every mile of interstate highway and measure how bumpy it is, right? And that results in an index number describing, it's called the International Roughness Index. We can average that lane mile, we can construct a lane mile average of that instrument reading for the whole system every year from 1990 to 2008. And in every year, the interstate got smoother over that period. Right, since 2008, funding has gone up. The data gets problematic starting in 2009, so it's hard to carry that measure forward. But funding levels have been going up, and so I think there's every reason to think that trend has continued. So the question is why do we want to spend more money on the federal aid highway system? Right, and I think that there are two answers to that. One is the interstate is only about 2% of all lane miles in the United States. It carries a much larger share of traffic, but it's a small share of lane miles. We don't have as good an inventory of the condition of other roads, right? So I think that we should be concerned about the condition of other roads. We don't know what kind of shape they're in. There's anecdotal evidence that there's trouble with some of those roads. That seems to me to be a big question we want to ask when we think about how to spend this $50 billion a year. The second thing is in spite of the improved quality of the interstate, travel times have been increasing. So the roads are getting more crowded. And so I think we want to think about how to manage congestion in sensible ways. The evidence is that building more roads will not alleviate traffic congestion. So we want to think about other strategies to do that. And then one more well, let me just stop there and hand it over to somebody else.
Okay, Scott, what do you think? Why is additional infrastructure important in broadband? We read about it on the front page of the Washington Post and other periodicals every day, but what do the experts think?
Yeah, so John, thanks for having me. It's always fun to be on these events. So the basic idea is that there are still lots of areas in the country that don't have access or have subpar access to broadband. And most of the funding, which is probably close to around $100 billion, if you include the IIJA, ARPA, and various other pieces, is mostly about dealing with this access issue. There are other issues regarding adoption, people who don't subscribe where there is service, and there's some money for that too, but most of it is going to access. Now, in terms of the economic effects, let me offer some unpopular views because that's always fun. And the thing is, I don't think that the net economic effects for the country of this are very big. The broadband is missing in areas that aren't going to add a lot of economic value to sort of our net economic value to the country. However, I'm not saying that it's not worthwhile, because there are a couple reasons why it still is. One is that it's an equity issue. We sort of have the social contract that we want people to have some minimum level of in this case, connectivity. And that's a separate and totally fine a thing that we should do. But it's important in terms of thinking about it. What the actual objective is. Now, I wish that philosophy applied to something like healthcare, but we've decided that for broadband. Now, it also may have positive local economic effects, useful for small towns to help people, to attract people, help them stay there or attract businesses. But a lot of that might be transfers from one place to another. So not an economic effect to the whole country, but still important locally. So that's that's where we're going now. In terms of ways that this can go wrong, I think the biggest is that we seem to be very carefully avoiding any lessons that we've learned from having done this in the past. We give out about $10 billion a year in universal service funds, about $6 billion of that for access issues. And we've done that since 1996. And in 2008, we had the BTOP program, which gave out another $4 billion in the same way we're giving out 42 billion of the money now. And most of the discussion has completely ignored that experience. It says doing it all from scratch, which is a mistake. We really have a good idea of what works and what doesn't, but we're not taking it into account. And what works, again, at the moment, very unpopular view, is generally reverse auctions if your goal is cost effectiveness. Now, at the moment, nobody wants to do that because there's this view that RDOF was a failure. The aspects of RDOF that failed had to do with eligibility, not the auction itself. And so but we're going to throw away the auction part of it because now.
God, may I interrupt just long enough to make sure everyone knows what RDOF stands for?
Oh, yeah. But instead of checking to make sure everybody understands it individually, I'll just say it was the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, and it was a reverse auction to distribute money to areas that the FCC had determined did not have service. And so a reverse auction, for people who don't know, is you start with a high number and you ask who will provide service for this level of subsidy. And then people say, raise their hand and say, I will. They can lower it and say who will still, and you keep going until you get the organization, the ISP that will offer service for the smallest subsidy. And since then, there have been questions about whether the main winners have the capacity to actually do what they said they would do and so on. So I don't want to diminish those real problems with it, but those don't have to do with the auction. And so it's a mistake to throw away the auction idea because of that. Now, other ways that we might fail is that it has too many objectives. Our objective should be about providing broadband and providing the most broadband we can for the amount of money that we have. But if you read the instructions, there are all kinds of other objectives in there. One is, promoting Buy American. And, that's great, except there's not enough fiber production domestically. You can look at Corning's earnings. Corning is the main fiber producer here. You can look at their earnings reports and they talk about higher prices because of higher demand. And, generally, that the requirement, the Buy American requirement just drives prices of equipment and labor up. There are lots of equity objectives in terms of hiring and who and different groups whose objectives you need to take into account. Now, personally, I agree with just about all of those, but each of them adds cost to the process, and every dollar that goes to advance a different objective is a dollar not spent on broadband. And maybe that's okay as long as we have a serious discussion about how much we're willing to spend on those other things, because they're not free. And the other thing is that there hasn't been really much focus on evaluation at all yet. And to do that right, you need to build it in from the beginning. And that's kind of being ignored, and I worry about that. So I'll leave it there.
Scott, you've teed up a lot of things we want to come back to, I think. Let me turn to Fred though and ask Fred, what are the opportunities in rail? Why are additional dollars spent in rail going to create an upside for the country?
Yeah, this is a great question, and thank you, Professor Mayo and Mocker, for inviting me. First and foremost, let me give you an overview for those who don't understand the rail industry and who we at the AAR represent. There are sort of three tiers of freight railroads. There's the Class 1 railroads, which are the really big railroads. Then there's Class 2 and 3s, which are smaller, regional, and local, what we call short line railroads. And then there's the Amtrak, which is passenger railroad specifically, and there's large commuter railroads as well. Think of like Metra or MARC here in DC or VRE. And so we at the AR represent primarily the 7 largest Class 1 railroads, Amtrak, some short lines and some commuters. So why are railroads in here? I think first and foremost, it's not just because Amtrak Joe is in the White House, although Amtrak did get $22 billion in this bill to help develop their system, increase and enhance, not only the Northeast Corridor, which it owns, but also other lines where they operate on freight railroad lines or commuter lines. And if you want to add or expand that, this bill definitely recognizes that you need the infrastructure dollars to do it, to help build that out, so that you're not, interfering with what's being moved by the freights. But so the breakdown here is $66 billion for railroads. Like I noted, 22 of that is going to Amtrak. That's 22 in what is somewhat unique in this bill called advanced appropriations, meaning sort of real dollars that are there sitting in the Treasury ready to be spent each fiscal year that they're allocated for. So that's unique because it's not just an authorization of appropriations. It says, hey, spend up to this much money, and appropriators, you need to appropriate this amount or up to this amount. So there are those authorizations of appropriations, but those are on top of the 66 billion in advanced appropriations. So when you really look at it, you have 66 billion of real, quote, real money. And then you have 36 billion of these fully authorizations where you could have each fiscal year more money appropriated to these programs. So what are the programs and why are they important? Well, obviously Amtrak is important. It's it's a creature of statute. It was created in statute, but it does need federal dollars to help it operate. And so they got money for operations and capital, which is not uncommon, as I noted. And then there's infrastructure grant programs that are available for freight railroads, primarily small freight railroads. A lot of the Class 1s aren't eligible for these grant programs because we fund a lot of our pretty much all of our infrastructure development through, our own businesses. So we spend up to over $20 billion a year in private dollars to upgrade and maintain and keep our networks running. Now, that doesn't mean that, these grant programs aren't important. They're very important, and we are very supportive of them because they can help with local communities or states that want to, as Matt was noting, to reduce congestion, take a lot of trucks off the road, or eliminate some of those grade crossings, separate those so that you don't have those delays on the roads. So those are really helpful programs that can sort of partner with the private dollars that the freight railroads can bring to the table to really build out these bigger projects that might be very expensive and might not, check out on the infrastructure capital investment side for the private business. But if the public is getting a benefit, they can get these grant dollars and put money in. And we have an excellent example of that, which we can talk about a little bit later. It's called the CREATE program in Chicago, where 6 of the 7 Class 1s that operate there, Metra, Amtrak, and the states, locals, and counties have all come together and developed a program of multiple projects. If you've ever been to Chicago, it's like the rail capital of the country. And that's helping move more products through Chicago quicker and more people within and through Chicago faster. And that gets to my other point. Why is rail in here? Well, rail didn't used to be part of these infrastructure, or what we used to call highway bills, until 5 or 6 years ago in the FAST Act, which something I was on the Hill for at the time. But now it's been added in. And why is that? I think it meets a lot. The reason is it meets a lot of goals for this administration and for us as a, as a society. One being freight rail is, and passenger rail for that matter, is extremely energy efficient and environmentally sound. So when I say that, it's because we, a freight train can take hundreds of trucks off the road, thereby reducing that congestion, but also reducing the emissions. We're 3 to 4 times more energy efficient than trucking. So there you get the dual benefit. You reduce emissions and you get reduced congestion. The other reason is I think that there is a turn to look at, okay, passenger railroad can actually be one of the solutions here in not only reducing congestion, but reaching rural communities. I know that, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but a lot of the grant programs across the board, not just in rail, talk about rural set-asides, even setting aside specific amount of monies for that. So I think you can meet that mobility challenge and goal. And that's what Congress was thinking when they said, hey, let's put more money into passenger rail as well. So I guess I can leave it there. I think there's a lot of reasons that rail was included, not the least of which is some of those meeting some of the goals of this administration, be it environmental, be it congestion reduction, be it developing making us more economically competitive because we're moving more goods and people more efficiently.
Okay, so we've talked about the upside here in roads and bridges, broadband, rail. I think, and obviously enough legislators believe those upsides to have passed, as I said, in bipartisan fashion, the IIJA. Let me flip to the other side, and Scott gave us a little hint of where we might head with this discussion. But what do you see as the potential downsides? What are the potential threats between the euphoria of all these new dollars that are going to be allocated and what might actually land at the end of the day? And Fred, let me start with you, since Scott sort of opened the door on this. Let me start with you and then turn to Matt and see if Scott wants to pile on to his earlier comments.
Sure. No, I think it's an excellent question. And I think the first and foremost is just the sheer magnitude of the bill. I mean, you're talking, as you noted, about $1 trillion, 550 billion of that being new money, not just the planned funding that was already there or planning to be spent if you just continue prior programs. And the reason that's important is that, at least on the rail side, you're getting money, massive amounts of money going to these competitive grant programs. And actually Amtrak's money is managed through grants as well with FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration. So they have to manage all that and not only oversee the grants once they've been, award the grants, but you have to oversee the grants on the back end. And that takes a lot of money, and time for the administration itself. And when you have billions and billions going to an agency that, FRA was having some grants the last reauthorization bill in 2015, they got a little bit more. This is sort of on steroids. I mean, when I was in the Hill and we were negotiating that bill 6 years ago, we were arguing over $100 million here and there, right? That's a rounding error for some of these programs. So now we're talking about the billions and actually talking about a bill that's in the trillions total. So I think management and oversight internally within the agencies is going to be a challenge. I think this gets to one of the bigger themes we're seeing throughout the economy is hiring up the people that you need that have that expertise to do it. So certainly, I think that's a challenge. I think, you've got some excellent, very dedicated folks over there at FRA and DOT that are working hard to do this, but, you only have so many woman hours in the day to do it. So that's, I think, going to be a challenge. I think they're taking some steps to make it a lot more efficient and easy for them, but certainly that's something that you've got to be monitoring.
Fair enough. Matt?
So what are the things that could go wrong? So, so going back to let's build things that people use. The same data that I described on road quality is broken out by rural and interstate, by rural and urban. And the rural interstates are systematically in better condition than the urban interstates, right? So that's probably not too surprising, but that's a fact, and that seems like that's a little off, right? Because it says that the roads that people don't use are in better conditions than the ones they do, right? So as a starting point, I think we want to think about building things that people will use, making sure that we are not sending too much money to. We want to send the money to the roads that are most heavily used. That would be the first thing, right? The second thing is that there is a well-documented trend up in construction costs. So from 1950, there have been two pretty careful studies to do this. One of them mine, which document that the cost of building the interstate a mile or a lane mile has gone up by about a factor of 10 since 1950 in real dollars, through 2008. So that's a problem because we don't have a good explanation for why that's happened. So there's some of the easy explanations you can rule out. It's not unions. It's not that we're building more urban stuff. We're building more roads in urban places. Urban roads are more expensive. It's not, it doesn't seem to be, environmental regulation doesn't look like that's what's behind it. So we don't have a good explanation for why that's happening. We know it's happening. It'd be good to know why, because that means that we're spending a lot more on stuff than we used to, and presumably this new money will be subject to that same problem. It'd be nice to get that sorted out before we spend the $50 billion rather than after. Beware. I think the other thing is to beware of. I think these monies will, to the extent that they're not allocated by the regular mechanisms, I think we want to be careful what we do, because one-off projects are projects that the state DOTs don't have experience with, and so they're going to be learning on the job. So if we have a lot of one-off projects, we want to think about some way to sort of system and to sort of aggregate the state experience so that the different state DOTs don't make the same mistakes over and over again. That would be my list.
So again, I think there are a lot of thoughts that you have. I'm tempted to press ahead, but let me pause on what each of you have said just for a moment, because I think there's some important comments that transcend or might transcend across the areas. Scott, you mentioned the possibility of conflicting or multiple goals that may be at odds with each other in the broadband space. And I'm wondering whether there are examples of that in the rail and highway area, roads and bridges area. Fred, you mentioned the management challenges, which seem to me to be immense, whether you're talking about rail or roads and bridges or in broadband. And I'm wondering if the other panelists see management challenges and processes as important as you do, Fred, and how, and if there is any advice on how to overcome those challenges. So two questions. One has to do with multiple conflicting goals. Do they exist? And are they important? And second, how do we overcome some of these management challenges? Who spoke last? Well, Scott, let's go to you first. How about that?
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm sorry, I guess I jumped the gun on answering this question before.
Not at all.
But so, things that Fred and Matt said actually, apply very well here too. One is, as Fred, you said, that there are problems when you have money not allocated by the regular mechanisms. They have the institution set up to do this. Sometimes those have problems too, but that's exactly what happened here. NTIA is tasked with giving the money to the states, who will then distribute it. The FCC is the one that has actual experience in doing this, and they were completely excluded. And that, we can't do anything about it. That was Congress's decision, but that's going to make it harder. And Matt, also, maybe both of you actually mentioned the problem with finding with people and management. And I said something about the problems with finding labor, but another related issue in terms of management here is that, well, first of all, Congress set aside a huge amount of money for overhead, basically, for the states and for NTIA to use. It's like $4 billion. NTIA's budget doubled, and then this, with everything left, the states end up with something like $3 billion for administrative expenses. And I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of administrative expenses as a result. But so NTIA is hiring tons and tons of people. And when and this is not a criticism of the people, because you read about who they're hiring and you think, oh, that's a great person. That they're going to help a lot. And then you think, oh, but wait a minute, that's another person who's not in a state helping that state. And so a lot of the institutional knowledge is being sucked up by the federal government. And states need some too. And so that's, that makes it harder. And that's just in addition to the fact that the labor market is really tight. And that's another factor that's going to drive up prices. If it's okay, there's a question here that I think also relates to this. There's a question about the maps. And it was the sufficiency and validity of broadband maps, especially in very rural areas. And so, that's another problem, one that they're trying to solve, which is that we don't have a great sense of where actually there isn't coverage. And that was the idea of the FCC putting together this new map that they're calling a broadband fabric. And the idea is essentially to know whether every structure in the United States has coverage or not. And they're currently in the phase of identifying the structures, basically, whether it's a broadband serviceable location, and it's kind of a problem. The FCC itself is working really, really hard on this, and they've paid a huge amount of money to a company called CostQuest to put all the information together that they're getting. And now they're in a challenge process where companies and governments can say whether something is a broadband serviceable location. But even though the data is supposed to be public, they are not making it available to third parties. I'm just not allowed to see it. And now they said something else, and people are trying to figure out exactly what they meant, that NTIA is going to be paying CostQuest an additional $50 million for something else with the map. It's really unclear what's going on with the map right now. I would love somebody to sort this all out. And then the other thing is, I don't know that they're going to have to try to figure out how to manage error in the map, because they're building a data set. Data sets have error no matter what you do. And the challenge process is part of that. But even at the very, very end, they're kind of going to have errors. And so the mapping is an open question. It's going to end up better than what we have, but it's not going to be perfect.
Some very serious challenges there. Matt, both Fred and Scott spoke about ramping up the infrastructure of building the infrastructure, so to speak, the human infrastructure of building this infrastructure. In one of our earlier conversations, I thought you had a very interesting observation about timing, and this is an area that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but hopefully you can elaborate on this. Is that we have a desire to implement these infrastructure projects quickly, and that may create tensions for the efficiency with which they get done. Could you sort of flesh that out a little bit, please?
Well, I don't remember saying anything interesting about this, but I'll do my best. We heard this idea already from Scott. Corning can only make so much fiber in a year, yeah. Right? And so if you want to build more fiber, if you want to lay more fiber cables than Corning can build in a year, then you can spend infinity dollars and you're going to be out of luck, right? So you can only lay as much fiber cables according to building year. Presumably that phenomenon is pretty general. So if you want to spend 25% a year more on building roads and highways, or whatever fraction more on building rails, that at the end of the day, there's some capacity out there to do that. And I'm sure those folks are happy to take your money, but they have some fixed capacity. And so you might expect that trying to drop all this money really fast is going to be really good for people that run construction companies, but maybe not the most cost-effective way to build this stuff out. I think answering that question means sort of having a sense for what the population of capable firms is out there and how much they can reasonably do relative to what they're doing now, right? And I suspect that that's a problem. What Scott said was that they had auctions for broadband capacity to which not very many people showed up. That suggested, at least in that sector, there may not be a lot of slack capacity amongst these firms. These guys are not out there banging doors looking for work. At least in that particular example. So that could well be a problem, as we're going to try to drop a lot of money on fixed capacity, and the fixed capacity will absorb the money without necessarily giving us more stuff.
So what I'm hearing the three of you say is that a consideration of the timing and capacity matchup for implementation may be in fact quite important if we want to improve the efficiency of the implementation process. Let me turn to a different subject. I promised the panelists that we wouldn't, we're in a political season. I wouldn't ask for forecasts on politics, and we've got a midterm election now just 1 week away. But that said, I do want to ask the panelists for a sense of how, depending on the outcome of the election, the implementation phase of the IIJA might be affected. I think that's a fair game even for folks that aren't in the political forecasting business. If we could, Fred, let me ask you to offer up first, then we'll turn to Matt and then Scott.
Sure, happy to, and it's a good question. Thank you very much. So I think there's, and I do appreciate not having to predict the Arizona Senate election or something like that, 'cause who knows? But yeah, I think that there is, this is a really good question, because I think there is a couple concerns here. If you're of the mind of, we want to get this money, we want to get it out the door, we want to spend it. If the House or Senate or both change parties of power, there's probably going to be a lot more oversight of these programs, oversight of the administration, obviously, and how it's doling out the money and how it's managing the money. Is there waste, fraud, and abuse? But also how the money is being spent, in the states and the grantees as well. Are you actually achieving the purposes for which you decided you wanted to spend these billions of dollars? But I also think the other side, in addition to the oversight, and there's going to be more of it, I'm sure, if it does change, is, as I noted, there's a lot of money in rail. There's a lot of money throughout this project that is advanced appropriations. That's real money sitting there. If these programs that are competitive grant programs, where you have to get applicants to come in and ask for the money, it's not like on the highway side where there's formula programs with formula money that just goes to the states and you're getting your formula because everybody can calculate it. These are competitive grants. So if you don't have the applicants coming in and asking for the money, maybe that money is not going to go out the door and it's just sitting there. And that becomes a target for appropriators or others to go in and claw some of that money back. In addition, as I noted in the rail space and in the other infrastructure spaces, or at least DOT related, there's these authorized amounts over and above the advanced appropriations. And while you might be getting some of that now in the Congress with the appropriators that are in place, if things flip and change, you might not be getting that extra money on top of what's already been appropriated. So those are a couple things that I think wouldn't surprise me if either one or both houses flip.
Matt, how do you see this playing out?
So just hypothetically, if you think that the legislature changes hands, then recent history suggests they'll spend a lot of energy trying to undo whatever the last session did, which is going to mean that they're going to try to take back some of this money, right? Like, in which case that's going to mean there's a lot of pressure to spend it fast. right? There'll be a lot of pressure to spend it fast, and I think that just compounds the problem that I just described.
Scott, any thoughts on this?
Yeah. So first of all, I love the question because since I'm not supposed to be an expert in this, I can't be held accountable. But I think Fred's point is really important, that that oversight is, if Congress changed hands, oversight would change, and not just the amount of it, the nature of it too. And that that could potentially have real effects. Also within each state, if parties change, if legislatures or governors switch parties, it's possible that their objectives will change too. Each broadband office has to make sure that the governors approve of what they're doing, and if the governors change, their objectives may change, which could send make some of their plans more difficult to implement. I don't know that this is harder in this case than with everything else the people who work in state governments have to deal with, but it's definitely there.
Yeah. So let me move away from politics to sort of a more practical issue, and that is that whether we're talking about roads and bridges or rail or broadband, if you read the legislation, the implementation phase is going to necessarily involve interactions between the public sector and private entities, between private business. How that interaction, how that interplay occurs and is designed may, it seems to me, make a very large difference in the efficiency with which we actually implement the IIJA. So I'm hoping to get your thoughts based on your collective and individual expertise about whether it's your experience or studies that you're aware of, on what implementors might do by way of designing the sort of four corners of the interaction process between the public sector and the private sector to make it go as smoothly as possible. And Fred, let me turn right back to you on this, because I think,
Sure.
if I'm not mistaken, the rail industry has been sort of a leader in that public-private partnership area in the past, and maybe we'll draft off some of your learnings.
Yeah, sure. And I think I appreciate that. Yeah, as I noted, there's this, what we call the CREATE program. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's in Chicago, and it's just that. It's a public-private partnership with the states, the localities, the railroads, the passenger and commuter railroad as well. And it's a recognition that to really implement these massive grant programs or grant funding awards and solve these infrastructure challenges we have to have everybody at the table working together on the front end to, either to identify the problem, identify what's appropriate solution, and then look for the grant funds that can help eliminate the problem or solve it. And then on the back end, actually having the group already in place to help oversee the process. And okay, we said we were going to do this by this date, and we set these plans and schedules to get that done. And I think that can be a model for sort of other programs elsewhere. And certainly we're at my association are actually starting to lay that groundwork and try and help because there's a lot of money in here that it can go straight to localities, or not necessarily just the state, where localities or towns and things are actually eligible for grants, these competitive grants, and they might not have quite the same level of expertise as, say, their state DOT. So we're kind of laying the groundwork and helping them understand what are the grant processes like at DOT, because maybe they've never dealt with the federal DOT before. So we're trying to help as much as we can from our side to build those relationships at that level for some of these states and localities to then be able to grow that relationship and, help them win some of the grants for, be it a grade crossing elimination or a project to, relocate some rail lines or improve the passenger service in that region. So certainly it's something that we're taking on the front end, but we hope it develops a relationship all the way through the implementation of and awardation of the grants.
Fred, before we move to other panelists on this subject, you raised something in my mind that is a question about the appropriate geography or what unit is going to get the grants, so to speak. You mentioned
Yeah.
localities. We've talked about states, regional areas, compacts.
Yep.
Are there principles that should guide that process in rail, and then others can think about whether those carry over to roads and bridges and broadband?
Yeah, you're right. It is a lot more than just states. It's localities, interstate compacts, groups of towns or counties or regions. They call them political subdivisions of a state, obviously, in the grants. But yeah, I do think that there is, there's an opportunity there to help them become more mature or develop the expertise that they need to help with these grant programs, but others. And I think that carries over. If you have a locality that is looking at one grant program at FRA over here, there's a lot of similarities with some of the other DOT competitive grant programs in terms of what are they going to be looking at in an application that can be very helpful if you get, a staffer or someone you can help educate and bring them up to speed on these programs, and it can be very translatable to the other grant programs as well.
Let me get us back to public-private partnerships. Matt, do you have any thoughts on how that can play out well or poorly in the infrastructure spending in roads and bridges?
So the nuts and bolts of whether public-private partnerships are successful, cost-effective or not, that's still something that is an active area of research, and I don't think it's well understood. But let me suggest it seems to me you can frame this question as being about market power, right? And so I think that if you think that the local governments are buying these services, these bridges, these railroad tracks, this broadband, and they're small compared to the service providers, then they're facing sort of adverse market power, and we think they're going to get burned. Right. On the other hand, the federal government is probably big compared to all of them. Right. And so then if we can get the federal government involved in purchasing, then we're purchasing as a monopsony buyer against a bunch of small sellers. Now, like which of those, the cost of that is you lose some of the sort of the local, you lose some of the flexibility that you have having local governments do it. And I think that that's the kind of tension that we want to be thinking about. It seems to me that what you want to be doing is try to get a sense for sort of the industrial organization of each of these sectors. How big are the construction companies? How big are the construction companies that build railroad bridges? How big are the construction companies that build train stations or lay internet cables compared to the people that are doing the purchasing? And I think that'll help us target places where there's going to be problems. Like places where the vendor is likely to have a lot of market power compared to the people that's doing the entity that's doing the purchasing.
Scott, do you have thoughts in this area?
Yeah, I think it's important that we be able to consider all types of organizational arrangements for building out. In this case, I'm talking about broadband. But it's also important to not become enamored of one of them over another, I would say. And they should be evaluated based on the same criteria of cost effectiveness. We shouldn't believe, public-private partnerships are inherently better than something else. In some cases they might be, and in some cases they won't be. And so I think it's important to just to be clear-eyed about any proposal, regardless of who it's from, in terms of thinking about its cost effectiveness.
Again, an important set of thoughts. Let me turn to another element of the implementation process that you have all, in one way or another, implicitly, if not explicitly, touched upon, and that is that implementation necessarily is going to involve interactions between the federal authorities and state, maybe local authorities as well. Are there ways to design the implementation stage in each of your areas that enhances the efficiency of those interactions between federal and as you said, Fred, political subdivisions that will maximize the efficiency of that process? Sometimes we see tremendous tensions between the feds and state or local authorities, other times working well. What's going to make this go well or not well in each of your areas? Let me start, Scott. Let me go back to you if I could, and then we'll go to Matt and Fred.
And maybe before you do that, let me interject. Lorelei Kelly has a related question in that, do you see any states that lead the way? And what she's asking for in particular is oversight purposes, monitoring and evaluation. So maybe answer John's question with the thought that Lorelei brings in, that maybe monitoring and evaluation, some states might be better than others. If you have any evidence of that in your question. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I should go back for a second and issue a disclosure. When I'm talking about map issues, TPI has a stake in this because we have our own map that I think beats the pants off of anybody else, and so we really want access to this fabric. So notice that disclosure was also an advertisement. But in going to your actual question, yeah, I think it would be good if there were ways for the federal government to help states work together, because it's going to be difficult, if not close to impossible, for every state to design its own program by itself, especially small states. And John, as you and I wrote along with Greg Groston, that would be something very productive that NTIA, the federal government, could do to help the process, because it seems really inefficient to have lots and lots of states designing their own programs. Now, in terms of whether there are any standout states, it's too early. We don't really know. And in part because we're not allowed to see the proposals that have been submitted so far. There are some transparency issues with this program. So we'll see.
Matt, I saw your hand was up. I was going to go to you next.
Yeah, so on highways, I don't know the answer, but there's a basis for answering that question. So Zach Liskow and Leo Brooks have written a nice paper looking at the evolution of costs of building highways. And one of the things that they do in their paper is look at the differences by states. And so they find that there's a lot of heterogeneity, and there's big differences across states in the cost of building new miles of interstate. That those numbers, like, so you can pick out the states that are low cost and high cost by looking at the appendix of their paper.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me turn to something else that you have mentioned, and that is in each of the areas, the implementation process will necessarily involve competitive grants or a competitive process for allocating funds to particular entities. This is an area where, Fred, I don't mean to exclude you as the lawyer in the group, but economists really have given a lot of thought to. And I'm sure you'll have very important thoughts on. But I do want to sort of ask you each, how are the competitive dollars going to be spent? How are they going to be allocated in each of your areas as far as you understand it? And how should they be? Well, this makes, I know, and let me jump to telecom because Scott is an expert on the auction process. It makes a big difference on how efficiently you allocate resources. So Scott, what's the envisioned process in broadband for allocating funds with a competitive grant? Is it specified? Is it unspecified? How do you envision that happening, and why will it make a difference?
Yeah, it has to be a competitive approach, but it's not. The states can do anything they want that satisfies that criteria. Their plans have to be, NTIA has to approve their plans, but it doesn't say they have to do it one way or another. I mean, like I said, I hope they take experience into account. Sarah O. Lamb, at Senior Fellow at TPI, did a paper on the BTOP program and did some simulations and found that if the money had been given out by reverse auctions, it could have served twice as many locations, and that the process that they'd used, which they called competitive, but it was where individuals kind of just evaluated grants themselves, it was sort of no better than random allocation of money. So hopefully we've learned something.
Okay. Matt, or how's this process going to play out in roads and bridges? How's it historically played out? How's it going to play out with 550, or in your case, $110 billion worth of additional roads and highways?
So I don't have anything very satisfying to say. I think it's going to play out badly. All right. The reason I think that is because, like, we now have a long history of dramatic price increases in construction of highways, for sure. And a lot of anecdotal evidence that building the Second Avenue subway is like the most expensive subway line per mile of anything in the world. The Big Dig was dramatically over budget. So it looks as if, now the first reaction to that is there's a huge problem with the US ability to build big projects. I think that's just a little bit premature, right? Because we don't know how these projects are different, whether the extra stuff that we're buying is just waste, or if we're buying things that would pass the cost benefit test. We just don't know, right? And so it's clear that there appears to be a problem with costs. We don't know why, right? So this is going to be a plug for research. Part of the reason we don't know why is that there's not good data, and I think that the data is buried in the state and federal government, sort of contract level data. What were the details of these projects? How do those details change over time? How do the prices of, like, the different components of these change over time? Does it look like the government is getting a progressively worse deal over time? Does it look like the process is tangled up? We just don't know. But I think that there's a real role for sort of all levels of government to facilitate data collection so that we can get a handle on why this is happening.
Yeah, Matt, one of the things I want to turn to next, just to give you a sense of this, is based on a comment Scott made earlier about the importance of evaluation in this implementation phase. You mentioned, Matt, the role of data and research. I put the evaluation, data, and research all in that same bucket. And let's come back to that. Fred, you have thoughts on the topic we were just discussing?
I do. I think one of the unique things about the IIJA, and certainly in the rail programs, as I noted, is this advanced appropriations idea, meaning that there's money already there. Why is that important for grants and for states and localities? Is that a lot of these grant programs are allowing for multi-year commitments by the government. You can't normally do that if you're jumping from annual appropriation to annual appropriation, because an agency can't commit money in the future that isn't there. It's a violation of the law. So any deficiency act. So what's unique about this particular bill with the advanced appropriations is that it does allow for some of that money to be multi-year, which means states can do a little bit more like what they do on the highway side when they have formula funds at a contract authority, where you can plan out and do things over a number of years. The other interesting thing here is that's different from prior massive slugs of money that we've seen happen, and I'm thinking way back to the ARA funding back in 2008 or 09, was that there was a requirement that the money be spent within 5 years. At least in the rail program, there isn't that sort of hurry up, that get the shovels on the ground now and spend it immediately, so that it didn't have to be, because otherwise it would disappear. You don't have that same trigger, at least as I've seen in this law, so you don't have the same sort of rush. Now, doesn't mean that people don't want to get the money out the door and spend it as quickly as they can, but it doesn't have sort of the same clawback immediately, provision. So I think that's a benefit as well, and it'll help, states, localities, these folks that may not have been as familiar with these grant programs, if they have a little more time and multi-year commitments to get these projects done.
You're
To
muted.
the extent that that the implementation process is going to be done at a state or sub-state level in many instances, and those states may adopt quite different mechanisms for allocating funds competitively. let me go to the issue that Scott first raised and then Matt touched upon about the importance of evaluation, data collection, evaluation, and research. Sometimes very well-meaning researchers in social sciences have a tough time with those evaluations and doing that research because the data aren't collected in a way that allows for meaningful research and for evaluation. Are there suggestions, principles, guideposts that Matt, you might offer, Scott, you might offer that will help us do the research necessary to evaluate what are the most effective ways in which we can allocate funds through a competitive process? Matt?
So I don't think any of us knows the answer to that question, right? So like you've asked us several questions about like how should we allocate this money, and how do we improve the efficiency of the allocation process? And I'm not I won't claim to be an expert on that. Like I know about what happens after you build things, not so much about the process of getting money out the door. But if you told me that we don't have a good handle on what's the best way to do this, like I believe that. Right. So what that suggests is that that is a process that is ripe for experimentation. Right. And so given the extent to which we've all struggled to answer this question that you've asked now 3 times, that suggests that that maybe there's a case for experimenting with different ways of handing the money out and see which works. We could have some auctions, we could have some grants, we could have some formula funding, and see sort of, to the extent that's possible, do randomization, and to the extent that's possible without being stupid, do randomization, and try to learn which of these allocation mechanisms, which of these funding processes works better. That'd be a great thing to do.
Scott, I know you've been a big champion of this in the past in the broadband space. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt's absolutely right. Building an experimentation would be amazing. And, you know, the fact that we're doing it across states does, you know, lend the possibility, create the possibility of using states as, well, laboratories of subsidies anyway, if not democracy. And so we could take advantage of that. But we really have to start thinking about it now. States have to start thinking about it now because it's much easier. You can't do an experiment after it's happened. And also thinking about it now forces you to decide what it is what your goal is. And it's, you know, it's much easier just to gloss over that and not think about it. Well, sorry, I lost my train of thought on that, but I guess I'd leave it there.
Scott, let me just, this may not be what you were thinking about, but did the FCC not attempt to do such a thing with a variety of broadband experiments that were implemented, but just really didn't have the continuity of design that allowed for economists to really evaluate what factors really did turn on access and or in that case adoption of broadband?
Yeah, but first I remember what I was going to say. States should also be creative in thinking about how they do these evaluations. What normally happens, not just the states, but the government, they'll spend a huge amount of money on a consulting firm that will make a nice, you know, glossy, slick paper. You know, use much less money and hire, you know, give the money to some universities and let professors hire grad students to do a whole bunch of studies. I mean, grad students are cheap. They're cheap and they're smart. So, you know, we could get a whole lot of work if we did something like that, but, you know, we never do that. The money's going to go, they're going to overpay for a terrible report if history is any guide. But, you know, don't do that. Try something different. So, but to go to your point, John, a problem with the Universal Service Program is that it's not regularly evaluated officially, and the GAO constantly says that it should be. And you know, the FCC has tried to do some experiments, and that was in sort of on adoption programs, not not access programs. And we learned a lot from that, and we should be able to. One thing people will often say in response to doing experiments like this, they'll say, well, it's not fair. How can you introduce some kind of randomization to a company's subsidies, or offer one kind of subsidy one place, another place? But and that sounds like a straw man, but that is actually an argument people make. But we do that all the time with people. We test drugs that way. Somebody gets a placebo and others don't. So, there's no real reason why we couldn't do that kind of thing with subsidies too.
Yeah. Let me ask one final question. Then if there are questions from the audience, I want to turn to those. And that has to do with something you have each mentioned also in your own way, and that is the geographic distribution of the funds that will be spent. We are a big country. This is a lot of money, but we have to decide where geographically those funds are going to be spent. Are there guiding principles that should be employed in that process? And Fred, let me start with you and then go to Scott and finally Matt.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, some of those guiding principles are at least set forth in the set aside that are created in some of these grant programs for rural areas, and just be it, a percentage that needs to go to that amount, that rural area, or amounts of the grant that need to hit those rural areas. That's something that, Congress has given. Now, I think what the grant programs have also done is set, depending on the program, different preferences, not the least of which is, how much, what are the safety benefits? What are the economic benefits for some of these programs, or how can you, some of them require actually a cost benefit analysis, some don't. It just sort of depends on the program. But I think, certainly when it comes to transportation grants, when it comes to rail grants, looking at safety as a guidepost should, always be number one, and is. And then I think you look at the other benefits that can be developed from that, be it economic or environmental or otherwise, or just, more efficient reduction of congestion and efficient movement of goods. So those are some good principles. Even in rural areas, those are very applicable.
Scott?
Yeah. So I mean, if it were up to me, then we would define an objective and have reverse auctions and give out the grants, from most cost effective to least cost effective, so we get the biggest bang for the buck. But it wasn't, and Congress set a lot of these. So the money's first going to be distributed to the states based on a state's share of the total unserved population in the country, which has a couple of interesting implications. One is that at this, before the money is given out, it's in a state's interest to show as much unserved area as possible. So, we kind of race to the bottom where it looks like nobody's served at the end, because, an additional percentage point is worth a lot of money. And the other interesting thing is that the only official use of the FCC's new map is to estimate that unserved area. And they're doing it because the existing method probably overstates coverage. But the thing is, there's no reason to believe that the overstatement is biased differently in different states. So after all the effort from the map, we may end up with exactly the same allocation that we would have had if we just used the existing map. But that said, I hope states use the map because it will be better than anything else that's out there. And so they should at least use it as their baseline. But then within each state, they're going to have to answer your question, because then it's not just unserved, it's also underserved. And each state will probably have different answers to how they feel they should distribute it.
Matt, final word.
I think that this is a pretty fundamental question. The question of why are we building? How do we avoid, don't do stupid things? That's I think the guiding principles. Don't do things that are stupid. How do we do that? Well, a good rule of thumb is let's build things people are going to use, right? And that sounds easy, but in fact, there's a lot of pressure to build things which will serve other goals, right? And that will promote economic development in some place which is poor, all right? And those things are, not to say those things aren't good, but the evidence that things that we build are going to have a big impact on those other goals is mixed at best, right? And so start with, let's build stuff people will use, right? build stuff people will use. And if you find that to justify a project, you have to appeal to this sort of these intangibles, then think twice.
Great.
That's all I got.
Jeff, are there
Yes,
questions?
we actually have a few outstanding questions, some of which we've answered as we've gone on. But Jeff Frank, a while ago, when you all were talking about management and the hiring of expertise, raised this issue similar to physical production capacity limits. The last time FRA, in particular, Fred, received a large appropriation of funds, the funds weren't continued. When FRA subsequently lost much of its expanded and skilled grant workforce as a result. Now that's specific to FRA, but in general, for all three of you, there's a 5-year time frame and the difficulties that most agencies have in federal hiring. How can our agency reasonably build the necessary government capacity within this relatively short window, and then for such a short window afterwards? Any sort of thoughts there? They got to ramp up quickly, and then they're going to have to ramp it down quickly. Fred, you can start, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. And I think one of the benefits here again is I think a lot of folks saw this coming, and I know FRA was very ready for it to hit the ground, or as ready as they could be. What they were actually undergoing a sort of organization, and they have a new whole group that it's fairly new group that they've created for the rail policy division that actually is managing all these grants and hiring up to manage the grants. So some of it's structural and being able to do that. Some of it is, there is a recognition in a lot of the grant programs and even the Amtrak grants that there's a takedown of money. And again, since these are advanced appropriations, that money's real, it's going to be there. But there's takedowns in the grants written into the statute so that you can, for the management by FRA of these programs. So I think that's another way that it's, the way it's been designed and structured is very helpful. In addition to FRA bringing in and reorganizing the way that they've done. And I think some of them, I can't recall if they got direct hire in this law, but I know that's another very, very helpful sort of waiver, so you can directly hire people without having to go through the competitive process to bring people on quicker.
Matt or Scott, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on it a little bit. It is an issue, and particularly in broadband, where a lot of the institutional knowledge has been explicitly excluded from it. It's it's a problem in building it. And it's hard because NTIA, like I said, they're hiring a lot of people, but a lot of those people would have also been useful in the States. And so you want to be careful about, and so like I'm saying, it's not a criticism of the people, it's because they're so good that they might have been helpful elsewhere. I mean, they're doing things like the State Broadband Leader Network, I believe it's what it's called. And I don't know what else they're doing to try to help build capacity within the states. But yeah, it's an issue for particularly states that haven't done this sort of thing before.
Just like first reaction is like there's a lot of smart people out there who would probably be perfectly happy to work at 3 times the wage the government usually pays. And that's hard to swallow. So the alternative is that these things get planned by lobbyists, I think. And so we're talking about having $500 billion worth of projects where if there's not adequate sort of in-house civil service supervision, then a lot of that's going to get offloaded to lobbyists and various funders to plan. Against that, that's a huge chunk of money. And so paying 5,000 people $1 million a year for 5 years is going to be a bargain, right? So thinking about ways that you can contract in people who might not otherwise do this kind of supervision, do this kind of work, seems like a natural thing to do. And it's going to be hard because you have to pay those people private sector wages. But given the amounts of money involved, that they knock 1% off of these contracts, they'll pay their wages 1,000 times over. That's all I got.
Great. We got 2 questions that are somehow a bit related. Let me try to combine them. Think here synergies. So Carly Noalis asked this question: are there incentives in the bill for road and bridges and rails to work together to support the development of transit-oriented developments or communities, reduce congestion or increase mobility. So are there synergies within IIJA that you guys are aware of? And then relatedly, Jeff Frank asks a question is, how might the Inflation Reduction Act by states and private enterprises, particularly in the energy transition, affect the implementation of IIJA? So are there any synergies or complementarities that exist, or are these going to sort of come to a head either within the bill or between some of the recent acts that have been passed? Any thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I won't say anything about roads and bridges specifically, but it's a great question because we've been talking about this, each one of us in our own expertise, which is the right way to talk about it. But they're also all related, and you can imagine synergies, but also we've all talked about labor issues. All these areas are pulling from the same pot. A lot of the work is very similar, so the problems get exacerbated because it's not just $45 billion in broadband. They've got to compete against the $250 billion going for roads, for labor and even expertise, because they talk about managing big infrastructure projects, and that just makes it harder. I'll let Matt and Fred talk about synergies.
So I guess one of the big, I think this is a really good question, and it gets into some of the real nitty gritty of some of how these grant programs are shaped and formed. At DOT writ large, there's other loan programs that you might have heard of, be it TIFIA, be it on the highway side or more FHWA side, and then there's railroad rehabilitation and improvement financing. We call it RIF loans as well, and there are synergies there in terms of using these grant funds, be it from a rail grant, be it from one of the cross-modal grants like infra or mega. I'm using a lot of the DOT sort of alphabet soup, but those are some of the other bigger grant programs that they have, where they say you can use these loan funds and leverage some of these grant funds. Use the loan funds as your non-federal match to leverage these grant funds elsewhere. So if you're getting, as we've seen projects become more intermodal in nature, having a highways component or a rail component or commuter component, you realize, well, I can get a loan over here for my federal match and then apply for my non-federal match, as the state, and then apply for these grants, be it, maybe the highway grant or one of the rail grants, and then utilize those funds together to do whatever your project is that might be intermodal, but eligible for both the grants and the loans. And you see that in several of the different grants, not just the rail grants, where they say, yes, you can use these loan funds that are also, federal loan programs as your non-federal match. And I think that's a recognition of that need to, that sort of intermodalism and cross nature of some of these projects.
Matt, any thoughts there on synergies?
Okay, well, we're, I think, almost out of time. And so let me just conclude today's webinar with a couple things. One is I want to thank our panelists who offered an incredibly rich set of ideas. Matt, thank you. Fred, thank you. Scott, thank you. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to be here today. Wonderful discussion. I think it was a very fresh discussion, one that moves us past, as I said, the euphoria of the passage of this act to the really important part of this legislation that has to do with implementation and ultimately how much new infrastructure we're going to wind up with in the ground to help make America as competitive as possible. So I want to thank all of you for participating. It was just a terrifically fun event. This will be recorded and will be available on the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy website. I'd encourage you to go back through it and outline some of the ideas that have surfaced here, take them back to your agencies and organizations, and improve the implementation process. Thank you very much to everyone.